Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are covering what can only be described as a full-scale regional war unfolding across the Middle East. This is not a series of isolated incidents. What we're witnessing is a coordinated, multi-front military escalation involving Israel, Iran, the United States, and proxy forces across Lebanon, Iraq, and the Strait of Hormuz. The mainstream press is feeding you fragments. Tonight, we're connecting the dots, because these stories are deeply, fundamentally linked. Maya, let's get right into it.
Absolutely, Alex. Let's start with the Israeli military's claim that it killed a commander of Hezbollah's elite Radwan force in Lebanon, as reported by Middle East Eye. Now, the Radwan force is not just any unit. This is Hezbollah's most capable special operations division, the tip of the spear for any ground incursion into northern Israel. Taking out a Radwan commander is a significant tactical strike, but we need to ask the question the mainstream outlets won't: why now? And what does this signal about Israel's strategic calculus on its northern front while it's simultaneously engaged with Iran?
That's the critical question. Israel is fighting a multi-front war and choosing to escalate in Lebanon at the same time Iran is launching hundreds of missiles at Israeli territory. The Israeli Defense Forces confirmed they intercepted 92% of over 400 missiles fired by Iran, according to Middle East Eye. Now, 92% sounds impressive when you read the headline. But let's do the math that nobody in the press is doing for you. 400 missiles, 8% getting through, that's roughly 32 ballistic missiles hitting Israeli territory. These aren't bottle rockets. These are sophisticated Iranian ballistic missiles. 32 impacts is a catastrophic number by any military standard.
And this is where the framing matters enormously, Alex. The Israeli military is spinning this as a success story, a triumph of the Iron Dome and the aero defense systems. And yes, intercepting 92% of an incoming barrage of that scale is technically remarkable. But the narrative of success obscures the reality on the ground. 30-plus missile impacts means damage to infrastructure, potential casualties, and a demonstrated Iranian capability to overwhelm Israeli defenses through sheer volume. The question defense analysts should be asking is, what happens when Iran fires 800 missiles instead of 400? The math stops working in Israel's favor very quickly.
Exactly right. And while the Israeli military is putting out press releases about interception rates, the Iranian Red Crescent Society is reporting that over 81,000 civilian units have been damaged in Israeli and allied strikes on Iran. 81,000, Maya. Let that number sink in for our viewers. We're talking about homes, apartment buildings, civilian infrastructure on a massive scale. This is reported by Middle East Eye, and the Iranian Red Crescent is a humanitarian organization recognized under international law. This level of civilian damage raises serious questions about proportionality and potential violations of international humanitarian law.
The 81,000 figure is staggering, and it's being almost completely ignored by Western media outlets. When we talk about civilian infrastructure damage on that scale, we're talking about a humanitarian catastrophe. Each of those 81,000 units represents families, represents people who have nothing to do with Iran's missile program or its military strategy. They are teachers, shopkeepers, children. And under the Geneva Conventions, the targeting of civilian infrastructure is explicitly prohibited. The principle of distinction requires military forces to distinguish between combatants and civilians at all times. The scale of this damage suggests that principle is being systematically violated.
And here's what the mainstream media absolutely will not connect for you. While Israel is striking deep into Iran and causing this level of civilian devastation, and while Iran is retaliating with massive missile barrages, the United States is not standing on the sidelines. South China Morning Post reports that a U.S. diplomatic and logistics hub at Baghdad International Airport in Iraq was targeted overnight by Iranian drones and rockets. 8 separate attacks, Maya. 8 waves of drones and rockets targeting an American facility in a sovereign nation. And here's the detail that should alarm every single viewer. Several waves of departures from the U.S. facility occurred on Saturday, meaning American personnel were evacuating before the attacks intensified.
That evacuation detail is buried in the reporting, Alex, and it's arguably the most significant element of this entire story. If U.S. personnel were evacuating Baghdad International Airport before the drone and rocket attacks escalated, that tells us American intelligence knew these attacks were coming. It means there was advance warning, which raises a profound question. Is the United States a neutral party trying to de-escalate? Or is it an active belligerent that is drawing fire because of its role in supporting Israeli operations against Iran? The answer, based on the evidence, is clearly the latter. The U.S. facility in Baghdad is described as a diplomatic and logistics center, but logistics for what, exactly? Logistics for the war effort.
And the Iraqi security officials who spoke to the South China Morning Post did so on condition of anonymity, quote, due to the sensitivity of the matter. Think about that. Iraqi officials in their own country cannot speak publicly about foreign military operations happening on their own soil. That tells you everything about the power dynamics at play. Iraq is once again caught in the crossfire of a conflict it did not choose, its sovereignty trampled by both American military presence and Iranian retaliatory strikes. The Iraqi people are paying the price for a war being waged above their heads, and nobody in Washington or Tehran is asking their permission.
This brings us to what I think is the most underreported dimension of this entire conflict, and that's the economic warfare angle. South China Morning Post published a critical analysis on how the Hormuz crisis underlines the vulnerability of global trade choke points. The Strait of Hormuz, for viewers who may not know, is a narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day. When a war erupts between Israel and Iran, with the United States directly involved, the Strait of Hormuz becomes a weapon. Iran has the capability to disrupt shipping through that strait, and the mere threat of disruption sends oil prices skyrocketing and destabilizes the global economy.
The South China Morning Post piece makes a brilliant historical comparison that I want our viewers to understand. They reference ancient Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, a major power that depended heavily on grain imports through vulnerable sea routes. Whenever those routes were blocked during wars, Athens immediately faced food crises that threatened the survival of the city-state. The parallel to today is exact. The global economy, particularly Europe and Asia, depends on energy flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran doesn't even need to close the strait entirely. The mere credible threat of disruption is enough to cause panic in energy markets, spike prices, and impose economic pain on billions of people worldwide.
And this is where you have to ask, who benefits from this instability? Because it's certainly not the Iranian civilians whose 81,000 homes have been damaged. It's not the Iraqi people whose airport is being bombed. It's not the Lebanese civilians living under Israeli strikes targeting Hezbollah commanders. The beneficiaries of energy market chaos are oil-producing states that can sell at inflated prices, defense contractors who are seeing unprecedented demand for missile defense systems and precision munitions, and geopolitical actors who use instability as leverage. Follow the money, Alex. Every missile fired, every drone launched, every barrel of oil that spikes in price generates profit for someone.
You're absolutely right, and let's name names. The defense industry is experiencing what can only be described as a golden era. The Iron Dome system, the Aero missile defense system, the Patriot batteries that the U.S. deploys, these are manufactured by companies like Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, Israel Aerospace Industries, Raytheon, and Lockheed Martin. Every interceptor missile that Israel fires at an incoming Iranian rocket costs between $40,000 and over $100,000 depending on the system. Israel just fired potentially hundreds of interceptors in a single engagement. Someone is writing those invoices, and someone is cashing those checks. War is, as it has always been, extraordinarily profitable for a select few.
And the cycle is self-reinforcing, which is the part that never gets discussed on mainstream networks. Iran fires 400 missiles, Israel intercepts most of them, Western defense firms restock Israel's interceptor supplies with taxpayer-funded military aid, Iran sees the restocking and escalates its production to build a larger arsenal for next time, and the defense firms profit again from the next round of procurement. It's an arms race that enriches the manufacturers on both sides while the civilians, the 81,000 damaged homes in Iran, the communities in northern Israel living under Hezbollah rocket threat, they bear all the cost and reap none of the benefit. This is the machinery of modern warfare, and it runs on human suffering.
Let's go back to the Hezbollah commander killing in Lebanon because there's a strategic dimension here that matters. Israel's decision to target a Radwan force commander while simultaneously engaged in a hot war with Iran is not impulsive. It's a deliberate message to Hezbollah, we can fight you and Iran at the same time. It's designed to deter Hezbollah from opening a full northern front. But here's the risk that Israeli strategists may be underestimating. Hezbollah has an estimated arsenal of over 150,000 rockets and missiles, many of them precision-guided. If Hezbollah decides that Israel is overextended fighting Iran, the temptation to launch a massive coordinated strike becomes almost irresistible.
And that scenario, Alex, is the nightmare scenario that keeps military planners up at night. A simultaneous full-scale engagement with Iran from the east and Hezbollah from the north would stretch Israeli air defenses beyond their breaking point. The 92% interception rate against 400 Iranian missiles was achieved when Israel could focus its defensive resources on a single threat axis. Add tens of thousands of rockets from Lebanon coming from a completely different direction, at different altitudes, different speeds, and different trajectories, and the interception math collapses. This is precisely why the assassination of a Radwan commander is so provocative. It risks triggering the very multi-front war that would overwhelm Israel's defenses.
Now let's talk about what the United States is actually doing in Iraq, because the framing of the Baghdad airport attacks as Iranian aggression against a diplomatic facility is deeply misleading. The U.S. presence at Baghdad International Airport is not simply a diplomatic outpost. It is a logistics hub that facilitates American military operations across the region. The distinction between diplomatic and military functions has been deliberately blurred to provide political cover. When that facility is attacked, the American public is told it's an attack on diplomacy, on peace. But the Iranians and the Iraqi militias aligned with Iran see it for what it is, a node in the American military network that is enabling strikes on their territory.
And the Iraqi perspective is completely erased from Western coverage. This is a sovereign nation, Alex. Iraq did not invite this war onto its territory. The Iraqi parliament actually voted in January 2020 to expel U.S. forces after the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani at Baghdad airport. That vote was ignored. American forces remained. And now, 6 years later, Iraqi soil is once again a battlefield in an American-Iranian conflict. The 8 separate attacks on the U.S. facility at Baghdad airport represent Iranian retaliation being carried out on Iraqi territory, with Iraqi civilians and infrastructure as collateral damage. Iraq's sovereignty is a fiction, and no major Western outlet will say that plainly.
The anonymity demanded by Iraqi security officials when speaking to reporters tells that story completely. These are officials in their own government, in their own country, who cannot speak on the record about what is happening at their own national airport. That is not the behavior of officials in a sovereign state. That is the behavior of officials in an occupied territory who fear reprisal from the occupying power. The sensitivity they reference is not about operational security. It's about political survival. Speaking honestly about American military operations in Iraq can end careers, or worse. This is the reality of American power projection in the Middle East, and it is built on the suppression of local voices.
Let's circle back to the Hormuz chokepoint analysis because there's a dimension that the South China Morning Post piece hints at but doesn't fully develop. The vulnerability of global trade to chokepoint disruption is not a bug in the system. It's a feature that great powers exploit. The United States Navy's Fifth Fleet is headquartered in Bahrain specifically to control access to the Strait of Hormuz. American dominance of global trade routes is the foundation of the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. When Iran threatens Hormuz, it's not just threatening oil shipments. It's threatening the architecture of American economic hegemony. That's why the U.S. response to Iran is so disproportionate. This isn't about missiles or nuclear programs. It's about maintaining control of the global financial system.
And that context explains why the conflict keeps escalating rather than de-escalating. Every diplomatic off-ramp has been systematically blocked, not by accident, but by design. The Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was a framework for de-escalation. It was unilaterally destroyed by the United States in 2018. Since then, maximum pressure sanctions have devastated Iran's economy, pushing hardliners into power and making military confrontation increasingly inevitable. The people who killed that deal knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted this war. And now that it's here, the same voices are on television telling you that Iran is the aggressor, without ever mentioning that America torpedoed the diplomatic framework that was preventing exactly this scenario.
The 81,000 damaged civilian units reported by the Iranian Red Crescent need to be understood in that context. These are not acceptable losses in a legitimate military campaign. This is collective punishment of a civilian population. And under international law, specifically Article 33 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, collective punishment is a war crime. Full stop. When you destroy 81,000 civilian housing units, you are not degrading military capability. You are terrorizing a population. You are creating a humanitarian crisis that will generate displacement, suffering, disease, and death for years to come. And the Western media treats it as a footnote beneath the interception rate statistics.
That disparity in coverage is itself a form of violence, Maya. When Israeli interception rates get headlines and Iranian civilian casualties get buried, the media is making an editorial judgment about whose lives matter and whose don't. An Israeli home struck by an Iranian missile is a tragedy that dominates the news cycle. 81,000 Iranian homes damaged is a statistic that barely registers. This asymmetry in empathy is manufactured. It is the product of decades of media framing that dehumanizes certain populations while humanizing others. And it serves a very specific political function: it makes Western publics compliant with wars that are waged in their name but against their interests.
Let's connect the Iraq story back to the broader pattern. The 8 attacks on the U.S. facility at Baghdad airport represent something that American policymakers have feared for decades: the unraveling of the hub-and-spoke military architecture in the Middle East. The United States maintains military bases across Iraq, Syria, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. These bases are the infrastructure of regional dominance. But they're also targets. Every single one of them is within range of Iranian missiles and drones, and of the militias that Iran supports across the region. The Baghdad attacks are a proof of concept. Iran is demonstrating that it can strike American assets across the entire theater, not just in direct confrontation but through distributed, persistent attacks that are almost impossible to fully defend against.
And here's the nightmare scenario that Pentagon planners are grappling with right now. If Iran decides to coordinate attacks on U.S. facilities across Iraq, Syria, and the Gulf states simultaneously with Hezbollah rocket barrages on northern Israel, with Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, and with direct missile strikes on Israel, the entire American military posture in the Middle East comes under simultaneous pressure from every direction. The U.S. cannot defend all of these assets at once. Something gives. And when it gives, the consequences cascade through the global economy via energy markets, shipping disruptions, and financial panic. This is not hypothetical. The pieces are already in motion.
The South China Morning Post's historical analysis is prescient in this regard. They reference medieval Venice as a trade hub that became wealthy precisely because it controlled choke points. When those choke points were contested, Venice's power evaporated. The modern equivalent is the network of straits, canals, and sea lanes that global commerce depends on: Hormuz, Malacca, Suez, Bab el-Mandeb. The current conflict puts at least 2 of these, Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb, under direct threat. If both are disrupted simultaneously, the impact on global energy markets, supply chains, and food security would be catastrophic, particularly for developing nations that lack strategic reserves and the financial cushion to absorb price shocks.
And that brings us to who really pays the price for this war. It's not the politicians in Washington, Tehran, or Jerusalem. It's not the defense executives watching their stock prices climb. It's the single mother in Cairo who can't afford cooking gas because energy prices have spiked. It's the farmer in Bangladesh whose fertilizer costs have doubled because petrochemical supply chains are disrupted. It's the factory worker in southern Europe whose plant is shutting down because shipping insurance through the Gulf has become prohibitively expensive. War in the Middle East is a tax on the entire world, and it's the poorest who pay the highest rate. That is the story no one is telling.
Let me bring this back to the targeting of the Hezbollah Radwan force commander. This strike is being reported as a tactical success, another high-value target eliminated. But what's the actual strategic outcome? Israel has killed senior Hezbollah leaders before, many times. It killed Ahmad Mughniya in 2008. It killed senior operatives repeatedly in Syria. And each time, Hezbollah has rebuilt, adapted, and come back stronger and more capable. The Radwan force was created after the 2006 war specifically to address the weaknesses that Israel exploited. Killing a commander doesn't destroy the unit. It creates a martyr, accelerates the promotion of the next commander, and reinforces the organizational culture of resistance. Israel is playing whack-a-mole with an enemy that has mastered institutional resilience.
And there's a domestic political dimension to these targeted killings that never gets discussed. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has historically used military escalation to consolidate domestic political support and distract from corruption investigations and governance failures. Every headline about a killed Hezbollah commander is a headline that isn't about domestic Israeli politics, economic inequality, or the judicial overhaul crisis. War is the ultimate political distraction, and the pattern is well documented. We've seen it before in 2014, in 2021, and we're seeing it now. The question every Israeli citizen should be asking is, does this military operation serve my security, or does it serve my prime minister's political survival?
That same logic applies to every government involved in this conflict, Alex. Iran's leadership benefits from external conflict because it redirects domestic anger over economic hardship and political repression toward a foreign enemy. The American defense establishment benefits because regional instability justifies the $800 billion annual military budget and the network of global bases that projects American power. Every actor in this conflict has domestic political incentives to escalate rather than de-escalate. That is the structural problem that makes peace so elusive. Peace doesn't serve the interests of the people who make the decisions. War does. And until that dynamic changes, the cycle continues.
Let's talk about the information war, because it's as consequential as the military one. The Israeli military's claim of a 92% interception rate is itself a weapon. It's designed to project strength, to reassure the Israeli public, and to deter further Iranian strikes by suggesting that they're futile. But it's also designed to shape the international narrative. A 92% success rate sounds like victory. It sounds like Israel has the situation under control. What it obscures is the reality that missile defense is inherently unsustainable as a long-term strategy. Interceptors are far more expensive than the missiles they're designed to stop. Iran can produce ballistic missiles at a fraction of the cost of an Arrow interceptor. The economics of attrition favor the attacker, not the defender.
And the information coming out of Iran is equally managed. The 81,000 damaged civilian units figure from the Iranian Red Crescent serves Iran's narrative of victimhood and justifies further retaliation. I'm not questioning the number. I believe the humanitarian damage is real and devastating. But we should understand that every data point released in a war zone is released for a reason. Iran wants the world to see its civilian suffering because it builds the case for continued resistance and rallies international sympathy. Israel wants the world to see its interception rates because it projects invincibility. Both narratives serve power. Neither narrative centers the actual human beings caught in the crossfire. And that is where journalism must fill the gap.
The Baghdad airport attacks also reveal something crucial about the changing nature of warfare. 8 separate attacks using both rockets and drones represent a blended assault strategy that combines cheap, expendable drone technology with traditional rocket fire. This is the future of warfare, and it fundamentally changes the cost calculus. A drone that costs a few $1,000s can force the expenditure of a missile interceptor costing hundreds of thousands. Multiply that across 8 attacks in a single night, and you begin to see why traditional military superiority is becoming less decisive. The age of asymmetric warfare is not coming. It is here. And the US military's entire force structure, built around expensive, exquisite platforms, is increasingly vulnerable to swarms of cheap, disposable weapons.
And that vulnerability extends to the economic infrastructure we discussed. You don't need to close the Strait of Hormuz with a naval blockade. You need a few dozen drones and some anti-ship missiles to create enough risk that insurance companies raise their rates, shipping companies reroute their tankers, and the market does the rest. The weaponization of economic uncertainty is Iran's most powerful asymmetric tool. It doesn't need to match the US Navy ship for ship. It needs to create enough chaos in the insurance and commodities markets to impose costs that dwarf any military expenditure. This is economic warfare conducted through military means, and it's devastatingly effective.
So let's bring this all together for our viewers. What we are witnessing is not a series of separate conflicts. It is a single, interconnected regional war with global economic consequences. Israel strikes Iran and kills Hezbollah commanders. Iran retaliates with massive missile barrages and targets US facilities in Iraq through proxy forces. The Strait of Hormuz becomes a flashpoint that threatens global energy security. 81,000 Iranian civilian homes are damaged. And at the center of it all, the United States provides the weapons, the intelligence, the diplomatic cover, and the military infrastructure that makes the entire architecture of escalation possible. That is the story. That is what connects every headline we've discussed tonight.
And here's our call to action, because we don't do this show to leave you feeling hopeless. We do it to empower you. First, demand accountability from your elected representatives. Ask them directly. Do you support the continued flow of weapons to a conflict that has damaged 81,000 civilian homes? Ask them, why is American military infrastructure in Iraq being attacked, and who authorized the operations that provoked those attacks? Ask them, what is the plan to protect the global economy from chokepoint disruption, and who profits from the current instability? These are not radical questions. They are the basic questions of democratic governance, and your representatives owe you answers.
Second, diversify your news sources. If you're only reading Western outlets, you're getting half the story at best. Read Middle East Eye, read South China Morning Post, read Al Jazeera, read Haaretz. Read sources that challenge your assumptions. The 81,000 damaged civilian units in Iran is a story you will not find leading any major American or European news broadcast tonight. But it is real. Those people are real. And their suffering deserves the same attention and empathy that we extend to every other civilian population caught in conflict. The asymmetry of coverage is a choice, and you can refuse to participate in it by seeking out the full picture.
And finally, understand the economics. Every war has beneficiaries, and those beneficiaries have lobbyists, think tanks, and media allies whose job is to make escalation seem necessary, inevitable, even righteous. When you hear a pundit on television arguing for strikes on Iran or praising interception rates or calling for regime change, ask yourself, who pays that pundit's salary? Who funds that think tank? Who profits from the policy they're advocating? The answers are almost always defense contractors, energy companies, and the financial institutions that underwrite both. This is not conspiracy theory. This is the documented, traceable flow of money from war profiteers to war advocates. Follow the money, and you will find the truth.
That's all we have time for tonight on Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth. The stories we covered today, the Hezbollah commander killing, the 400 Iranian missiles, the 81,000 damaged civilian homes, the Baghdad airport attacks, and the Hormuz chokepoint crisis, these are not separate headlines. They are chapters in the same story, a story of escalation, profit, and human cost that the powerful would rather you not understand. But you're here, which means you're already ahead. Share this report. Talk about it. And never, ever stop asking the questions they don't want you to ask. Maya, take us out.
Stay informed, stay critical, and remember, the truth doesn't take sides, but it does have consequences. We'll see you next time on Truth Report. Good night.